Welcome back, Focus Learners, to another explainer. Today, we're diving into something I'm super excited about. We're going to uncover the hidden rules of human communication by asking one really fundamental question. What is genre analysis? Seriously, think of this explainer as, well, kind of like handing you a secret decoder ring. We're going to look at the invisible architecture behind literally every text, email, and research article you'll ever read or write. It's an absolutely fascinating world once you know exactly what to look for.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're taking a journey from abstract linguistic theory all the way down to how you, yes you, communicate every single day. We'll move way beyond just books and movies, explore a few different schools of thought, break down the actual anatomy of a text, and then wrap up by seeing how all this survives in our wild digital world and our own individual performances.
So, jumping right into our first stop, looking beyond books and movies. To really get this, we kind of have to completely dismantle our everyday, run-of-the-mill assumptions about what a genre actually is.
I mean, when I say the word genre, what's the very first thing that pops into your head? Probably sci-fi, right? Or romance novels, or maybe jazz music. Well, I want you to forget about all of that for a second. Ask yourself what this word means in the realm of everyday social interaction. Because in the academic world of discourse analysis, genre is absolutely not just about categorizing art or literature. No, it's actually about how we interact with one another in society.
And introducing the foundational ideas from scholars like John Swales and Carolyn Miller totally shifts our perspective here. Swales defines a genre as a class of communicative events sharing a set of communicative purposes. And Miller? She brilliantly calls it a frame for social action. This right here is your vital decoder ring. Basically, it means that out of all the countless possible ways to use language, we make this narrow, conventionalized selection, and we use it over and over to achieve specific social goals. So, whether you're drafting a heavy lab report, a grant proposal, or just firing off a quick Slack message to your boss, you, my friend, are participating in a genre.
Okay, moving on to the three main schools of thought. Now that we've totally redefined the term, let's actually explore the three distinct lenses that experts use to analyze these communicative events. You see, genre analysis exists on this incredibly fascinating continuum. As a researcher, you obviously can't look at everything all at once, so you have to pick your focus. On one end of the spectrum, you can zoom right in on the text itself, really dissecting the structural elements, the grammatical choices, and the linguistic patterning. Or, on the exact opposite end, you can zoom way out to the broader social context. That means focusing on the rhetorical situations, the overall social goals, and maybe even using ethnographic methods to see how a specific community actually uses that text in their day-to-day lives.
So that text-to-context continuum basically breaks down into three main academic traditions. First, we have English for Specific Purposes, or ESP. Then there's New Rhetoric, and finally, Systemic Functional Linguistics. Now, New Rhetoric leans heavily into the context side of things. It treats genre as a social action based in situations that happen over and over again. Systemic Functional Linguistics, on the other hand, views it more as a staged, goal-oriented social process. But it's actually Swales' ESP approach, which anchors a lot of contemporary academic studies, that perfectly blends these ideas. It focuses on shared communicative purposes, sure, but it realizes those purposes through strict structural text analysis. Which brings us right to the anatomy of a text. Let's step down from those big, broad theoretical schools and get into the concrete nuts and bolts mechanics of how a text is actually built, literally word by word. This theoretical background builds so perfectly into John Swales' famous concept, where every single piece of discourse is functionally organized into deliberate moves and steps. You can think of this as the structural DNA of communication. First things first, you identify the genre. Then you determine the moves. A move is basically a rhetorical unit that performs a specific, coherent function. A great example of this is the famous Introduction Method Results Discussion Model, or IMRD, that's used in scientific papers. And then finally, you break down the steps. These are the smaller elements, some mandatory, some optional, that actually construct a move. It's just a highly systematic way of breaking down exactly how a writer achieves their goal. And what's really wild is that we can actually see these moves being actively tracked and compared across completely different languages. In this comparative analysis looking at English and Uzbek scientific research abstracts, analysts went in and mapped out moves like purpose, method, and results. And what did they find? Well, they noticed that while English writers often separate these communicative functions using really explicit data statements, Uzbek abstracts more frequently integrate their purpose, method, and results using specific grammatical constructions, like nominal predicative structures. So what this proves is that while the surface-level linguistic features might be totally different across cultures, these deep rhetorical structures, these functional moves, they completely transcend those boundaries.
All right, let's look at systems, sets, and ecologies. Because genres don't just exist in a vacuum, do they? Let's examine what happens when these tightly structured texts collide head-on with the messy reality of the digital age.
In our modern digital landscape, the line between the so-called expert and the non-expert completely blurs. It's a phenomenon known as context collapse. Thanks to Web 2.0 and the massive democratization of science, we don't just have isolated genres anymore. No way. We have interdependent genre assemblages and massive, sprawling genre ecologies. Think about it. A dense academic article might now be linked directly to a lay summary, a science podcast, or even a citizen science portal. These genres are constantly interacting, evolving, and honestly sometimes mutating to serve multiple different audiences at the exact same time.
You could actually see this exact phenomenon happening with the PLOS Online interface. It's a perfect real-world example of a genre assemblage. Notice how a highly accessible, easy-to-read editor's summary sits right smack next to the main, highly technical scientific article. I mean, it's the exact same core scientific information, but it's packed into two entirely different genre containers. And they exist side by side to serve completely different audiences simultaneously, all within the exact same digital space. It's brilliant.
That to actually capture this chaotic, polyphonic digital reality, modern genre analysts have to use mixed methods, often leaning on an explanatory sequential design. Essentially, you start with the hard quantitative corpus data, using computers to count up the linguistic features and the moves across hundreds of texts. But then you follow that up with deep qualitative interpretation and ethnography to understand why those choices were made in the first place. You absolutely need the hard data to see the patterns, but you need that human context to actually understand the meaning behind them.
And that brings us to the individual performance. For this last part, let's explore that beautiful tension between the strict, rigid rules of a genre and the messy, unpredictable reality of the human beings who are actually using them. So much of early genre analysis focused really heavily on this idea of idealized competence. It basically treated genres as these perfect, abstracted blueprints operating in completely homogeneous communities where everybody just followed the rules perfectly. But come on, we know reality isn't like that, right? Modern theory contrasts that idealized blueprint against individual performance. Performance is the messy, totally unique, sometimes error-prone, and highly identity-driven way that an individual actually enacts that genre in the real world. Every single time you use a genre, you are performing it. You are injecting your own unique self right into that template. As the literature points out, when we pay attention to these individual performances, we can develop a way better understanding of how genres relate to things like identity, affect, and cognition. What this really highlights is that analyzing a single person's performance, flaws, quirks, and all, helps us uncover how memory limitations, everyday distractions, emotional states, and personal identity shape even the most rigid professional communication. We aren't just robots blindly following a linguistic script, right? We're complex individuals, constantly negotiating our space within these social frames. Which brings us to a final, slightly provocative thought to leave you with. I want you to look at your own life today and ask, what hidden rules are governing your own daily genre performances? I'm challenging you to take this new decoder ring for a spin. When you send your next email, when you draft a report, or even when you just read a news article, take a second and ask yourself, what are the shared communicative purposes happening here? What moves am I making? You are actively participating in a massive, invisible social structure. And let me tell you, once you start seeing it, you can literally never unsee it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.